first of all, I really want to thank your organization and your members for the invitation for me to come. It's a privilege and an honor to be speaking. I wish I could be doing it in person, but I appreciate everybody who's taken time out of their day to come in and listen to what I have to say. You know, it wasn't that long ago. I still remember when I was a student journalist writing about Antifa at Portland State University as a graduate student. And at that time I had no following and nobody listened to what I was saying. So to go from there in 2016 to the position I have now, where I testify in Congress and write for some national publications, I don't take any of it for granted. And I just have so much appreciation for people who find my reporting of value.
It's tremendous. Well, here you are, published in the Wall Street Journal, the National Review. You're the editor-at-large of the Post Millennial, and you've spent years now with Antifa and documenting what they're up to. So we're really interested in hearing about that tonight. But I thought, just to catch some of our audience members up, Andy, would you explain your background a little bit and how you come to this?
Sure. So, you know, for my reporting and all that, I try to remove myself from the story as much as I can. Sometimes it's impossible because of the assault that happened last year. But one thing that's come up is people have taken an interest in my family's background, because it kind of does tie into the views that I have now, the positions that I take in my open criticisms of Antifa's violent extremism. So my parents were political refugees to the United States from the former South Vietnam. And you guys are based in the Bay Area. San Jose has a very large Vietnamese American community. The Vietnamese American diaspora primarily come from the former South Vietnam, and the people there, like my parents, lived through a communist revolution. So in 1975, the forces from the north, the communist forces from the north, came into what was then the capital, Saigon. And then there was a revolution, there was regime change. And all of those who were either affiliated with the former government, either working in any capacity, whether military, or you could have even been like an office administrative role, or if you're considered bourgeois or counter-revolutionary, you were then subject to time in a prison camp to be re-educated. So pre-1975, my mother came from a middle-class family in the South, on a small coastal town. They successfully, her parents started a jewelry business and became very successful, had a family home. And mother came from a family of 10 siblings, so they're a very large family. But she was just a teenager in 1975, and pretty much overnight, her life completely fell apart. She, along with all her young siblings, were sent to a prison camp, and their sin was that they had wealth, and that they were accused of profiting off of the backs of the Vietnamese people. My father, on the other hand, came from a very poor family, but he was also sent to a re-education camp. And that was because he had an entry-level role for a police department in a small town. So the net for who was sent to prison camp was quite wide. And so that's the reason for why so many Vietnamese, when given the chance, fled the country by boat, unworthy sea boats, to refugee camps in Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines. And so they were colloquially called the boat people, boat refugees. United States, instead of washing its hands from its involvement in the Vietnam War, opened itself to hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees. Most of them settled in California, actually. And so that's my family background. And that's, okay, oh, this works. Is that showing up?
Yeah.
Okay. You see my family?
Mhm.
Okay, so right in the center right is my mother. Sometime, I believe this is 1974, with some of her siblings. So she was about 15 in this picture, and you can see she's wearing a traditional schoolgirl dress. And to her left was her older brother just before he was about to go to university in France. So this was one of the last times that the family was all together after he left to be an international student. His country fell apart and he was not able to return back. And he had no idea of even how to get in contact with his family. Um, Vietnam at that time was a developing country, and as I said, my father is very poor. I don't have very many photos of him in his youth because even though it was the 60s and 70s, it was actually quite a luxury to have access to a camera. But this is an early photo of my father in his youth. So my parents actually, after settling in the US, they got married in San Francisco. So part of my background story ties very closely to the Bay Area. And, you know, I share all this stuff about my family because what I'm seeing now and witnessing with so many young people in America, that's deeply concerning for me, is that they're calling for revolution and regime change without really understanding the consequences of what that entails on the people. Like, you know, you can look to countries like Vietnam or like Libya or Syria, any of these places where people have tried to do regime change, and it's what you have is massive death and suffering. And of course, if you happen to be on the losing side, like the South Vietnamese were, then the people suffer and that they're imprisoned and or killed. And so, you know, this background makes me so, helps inform my coverage of Antifa and why I view them to be such a threat. And when they call for violent revolution and taking up arms and toppling governments, and more recently, literally attacking government facilities and buildings, um, it I'm just brought back to like what my parents escaped. They came to this country for peace and stability, which they have, but now, particularly in certain parts of Portland and other parts of America, periodically you see scenes that look like a war zone.
Andy, I can't imagine what your parents have been thinking in the last year or so as they've watched this happen again in their lifetime in their country. It's so frightening how it can happen so quickly, and yet I think we are mostly an uneducated populace. And when I look at the images that you share, I'm kind of reminded of the dystopian video games and novels and whatnot that are so popular with younger people right now. I've wondered if there's almost a quality like that this is a game, that this isn't real. I mean, it's very real when you're out there every night, and the violence is very real, but this is unimaginable to most of us, and I'm hard pressed to think people understand the consequences of this. What percentage of these people do you actually think have a vision for going forward, and if so, what is that?
They have a ultimate goal, which in their own words is to destroy the United States, which they view as a imperialist and fascistic country. And there's a lot of weight to their words going back. Antifa, for your viewers and listeners who are maybe not familiar with this ideology, it's a communist anarchist ideology. So they take aspects from some of the worst components of communism, such as the confiscation of property, the redistribution of wealth, the sort of totalitarian excesses that we've seen in the 20th century. They take that and they combine that with the worst aspects of anarchy, which is no government, no chaos. So this multi-pronged attack on criminal justice system, on law enforcement, on on property. It's all part of this goal to destabilize. And what they really want is they think that the United States, so when they call themselves anti-fascists, like that sounds very noble, and a lot of people might describe themselves as that. But when Antifa use it, they're actually like what they're in opposition to is to the American philosophy. So there's a reason why they burn US flags, and they've even burnt the Constitution as well in Portland. And they view the US as a fascist state, very much similar to actually how after World War II, when East Germany was formed, that regime incorporated the so-called anti-fascist ideology into their sort of state rhetoric, and they called the US and West Germany and Western Europe as fascist. And so when the Berlin Wall was built, for example, the East Germans called it officially the anti-fascist defense barrier. So this is why like the control and remaking of language is really important to Antifa. So I would urge all your members and viewers to be very, very cautious and skeptical when you read things that refer to like anti-fascist or anti-racist, or even how they define terms like violence, for example. So they'll say things like words is violence now, or silence is violence. Whereas when they strike somebody in the face or start a fire to try to burn down a building, that is not violence. That is an act of legitimate protest.
It's astonishing. I think whoever owns the language owns the reality, so to speak, and that's frightening. Let's talk a little bit about Antifa. You're out there every night. Who are these people? What are you seeing? What's the makeup of these groups? Give us a sense of who's out there.
Sure. So Portland is just several hundred miles north of the Bay Area, and it's now on day 75, I believe, of daily violent protests and riots. The picture that I have on the screen right now is just some of the graffiti in downtown that was taken in June. And very clearly it says right there, Antifa. And so it's always been very baffling to me when the mainstream media, like Washington Post, whoever, do these fact checks and say that there's no evidence for Antifa. Like, you can look at the graffiti, you look at the chants, you look at the people involved, and you look at the even the political posts of those who have been arrested and charged, and there's so much evidence for Antifa. But what's been happening, not just in Portland, but other cities across the West Coast, is because there's been such a huge unrest in response to the death of George Floyd. There's been a faction of the fringe and far left who really see this as an opportunity to move forward with their extremist political agenda. So things like the toppling of statues. This is a George Washington statue that was toppled in Portland. The attack on the federal courthouse. This is the Mark O. Hatfield courthouse in downtown. This has been the place that was seen in all the shocking video of people breaking in, shattering the glass, starting fires inside, and throwing explosives. I took this shortly before the heavy-duty barrier was put up. You can see all the glass on the ground from people throwing glass bottles and other projectiles at police. This is another scene from downtown. So it's like what's happening now in Portland is quite dystopian, but it's not just contained to here. It's the group that's been calling for the violence is the Youth Liberation Front. And they're a relatively new Antifa group. I think what people should be aware of is that there's no one Antifa organization. There are many of them, and some of them don't have Antifa in the name. So in Portland, there's Rose City Antifa, but there's also the Youth Liberation Front. There's also Popular Mobilization. So don't really get hung up on the name. Which you should pay attention to is the ideology they espouse, the tactics, and the people who are involved, because it's frequently the same people. And the local cell of the Youth Liberation Front has been spearheading the violence recently. And they actually, on the 25th of July, issued calls for violence elsewhere in the country, and their followers obliged. We saw on that weekend, there was violence in Seattle, Eugene, Oregon, Oakland, Tempe, Richmond, Austin. So they have a lot of political influence, and they organize primarily through social media. And this is where big tech in Silicon Valley comes in. Silicon Valley has been, or big tech has been extremely overly cautious in shutting down any so-called far-right extremism online or far-right disinformation. But they've really turned a complete blind eye to far-left extremism. And I don't just mean like radical rhetoric, but actually groups who are openly organizing and saying, meet here. We're essentially organizing riots through Twitter and Facebook, and they're doing it with impunity. All the forces that are coming together that is allowing what's happening in Portland to continue for more than 2 months now. It involves big tech, but also involves that the local authorities don't really have the power to effectively make arrests. They can make arrests, but then immediately people are let out without bail, and they go out and riot sometimes within the same day. And then, of course, unfortunately, we have a new DA who is very much in the same philosophical lining as the district attorney in San Francisco, which is that he believes in so-called restorative justice. So today at a press conference, the district attorney's office from Multnomah County announced that they are not going to be prosecuting those charged with felony riot, harassment, interfering with police, resisting arrest, escaping, and that even charges of felony assault on police are going to be, in their words, highly scrutinized.
So basically what you're describing is complete lawlessness.
Absolutely. So I'm going to play just a little bit of a video that I recorded incognito in downtown Portland a couple of weeks ago, so that your viewers can see what's going on here. So when I'm showing these sort of very visceral scenes, it literally is like a war zone. On that particular night, they tried to break down this fence. And this fence, by the way, can withstand, there's concrete on one side. It can withstand a car plowing through it actually. But when you're having thousands of people pushing on it, and in the case of the next day, actually tying rope all around it and hoeing and pulling it down, it went down. And so this is what was happening day in and day out in Portland. And the goal of the rioters very clearly was to break into the federal courthouse and to burn it down. And they had been trying that already for weeks. And so in my view, the response from the federal government in sending in various units and agencies within DHS was completely appropriate. It was very, very frustrating to see the local and national press reporting what was happening in Portland as if there were quote unquote stormtroopers or secret police disappearing people, abducting people for no reason. As you can see, when you're having people engaging such violent criminal action, and many of them are from out of state, by the way, it deserves a response. And unfortunately, only a minority were arrested and charged because, as you can see there, when you have thousands of people, it's extremely hard to make an arrest.
It's actually shocking when you watch the video. The audio didn't come through on that, but when I watch your videos in the morning, part of what's so disturbing is the audio, because people are screaming. They're just completely enraged, and I kind of wonder, Andy, what is it? I think young people, they have the energy to be impassioned, but I think there's something that's very attractive to them about this. I would argue that they have a sense of belonging and meaning and purpose in their day. Do you think this is filling a void that was there?
That's a great question. So one of the things that I've been focusing on for the past several months is actually to document the arrest records every day of those who arrested at the violent protests and riots, and finding out as much information as I can on them, because frequently this is usually the only way that we can get a sense of who's behind the mask of these Antifa mobs. And disproportionately, a lot of them are, in my view, seem to be people who are very vulnerable, either dealing with issues of homelessness or gender identity crisis. Disproportionately, many of them are transsexual or transgender as well. So it's my view that this Antifa ideology it's like a gang. It provides the belonging for people. And, you know, the people who are sucked into this ideology and who then partake in the organized violence, the ones who are sort of on the front lines who get arrested are the ones who are considered, in my view, they're probably treated as disposable to the movement, because the ideologues and the thinkers, and these are frequently intellectuals or maybe even journalists or academics, they don't put themselves on the front lines. They put other vulnerable people who can sort of be easily disposed. So I have actually sympathy for a lot of what's going on. These are, in my view, young people who appear to be hurting a lot, and they want belonging, and they find it in this extremist ideology that gives them meaning and purpose. And in many ways, it's like a religion. You know, so many of some of your invited guests in the past and many other conservative thinkers have talked about how this far left so-called social justice worldview fills the voids in people's lives, much like religion used to. So this community, this purpose is a unifying ideology, and they can. And unfortunately, in Portland, very few actually get held accountable, even if they're arrested. As I said, it's a catch and release, and now with the new DA, the charges will not be prosecuted at all.
Yeah.
So you have people who are filled with a lot of hatred. I think one thing that this country will have to confront is that why are so many millennials and Gen Zs drawn to not just socialism, but communism and anarchy? For whatever reason, they feel left out of the political process, feel left out of the any economic process, feel left out of the American dream. I think I blame a lot of that on what's been allowed to sort of ferment for decades in academia now, these critical theories that are not just explicitly anti-American, but anti-liberty, anti-freedom, and are instilling in the minds of people hatred, not just for who they are, but what their country is and the founding ideals. And so I think the violence and unrest that this country is facing right now is the result of decades of brainwashing. And so, yes, so much of this ties in to academia.
Yeah. It's pretty hard to defend and protect and love what you don't understand. If you don't understand the blessing of liberty, if you have no real, if you're not educated about it, and we've done a horrible job in civics, then it's kind of inevitable that you won't cherish it. Andy, let's talk about what's actually happening in Portland and Seattle right now. Last night, the Seattle police chief resigned. That was dramatic. She said she didn't feel that there was enough respect for her force. Do you want to say anything about that?
Um, it's a Seattle has some dark times ahead. So recently, it um, had to deal with, in addition to really violent scenes that broke out at the end of May. Particularly, you saw a whole street where cars of police were just completely engulfed in flames, and masked black bloc Antifa militants broke into these police vehicles and actually stole guns such as rifles, and were brandishing it out in the open. There was no police nearby at all. It was actually private security that disarmed at least two of them. Private security of a TV station, by the way. Then after that, you had them taking 6 blocks of an area nearby downtown in Seattle called Capitol Hill and establishing what they call their own autonomous zone. They named it the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, also known as CHAZ. And actually, I went there undercover because I couldn't really believe that. It was hard to believe that really in the middle of the biggest city in the Pacific Northwest, that marauding armed gangs were able to take city property and maintain it. And then I went there and that's what I saw. And so for 3 weeks, you had a project, an experiment, and Antifa's ideology put into practice, actually. This was an area where there was so-called no property rights. Everything was communally owned, which sounds nice. You have this outpouring of all these donations coming in, endless food and all that, and it brought so many people in. But of course, then at night, what you saw were there were numerous assaults that happened, and police could not respond to these. There was a attempted rape. There was attempted arson of the police precinct that was there that was abandoned. People tried to burn it down. And then there were 6 different shootings, 2 homicides. So this result of this experiment in this autonomy, the so-called autonomous zone.
Mm-hmm. And Andy,
And
these are the mostly peaceful protests we've been hearing about, right?
exactly. You
Yeah.
know what sort of maintained that momentum there was when the national press started reporting on it. They were talking about how, oh, this is a peaceful area. Look how wonderful it is. Donald Trump calls the people here domestic terrorists, but business owners love it. Business owners didn't love it. There's a class action lawsuit involving many businesses and residents there who are suing the city for allowing complete anarchy and chaos for weeks.
How are they responding to not being able to get services, police, fire, emergency services for themselves because the police are so preoccupied with all of this rioting?
So during when Chaz was alive, the area was actually physically blocked off by checkpoints and barriers and walls. The militants had used stolen city property to block it off, so you couldn't drive in. And to walk through these areas, you had to go through like checkpoints. They really kind of created like a pseudo um, Lilliputian state, this mini state, where there were armed guards at it. And apparently, in the second killing, it involved their security, although nobody is cooperating with the police, so we don't really know the details. But it was crazy that the mayor allowed this to happen. The police chief, Carmen Best, she tried her best. She, in subtle ways, pushed back on city council and the mayor, and I think it seemed like what broke the camel's back yesterday was that the city council voted to slash tens of millions from the budget of the Seattle police and getting rid of 100 positions. And there's only so much leading a police chief can actually do without the support of a city council and mayor.
Yeah.
And she resigned today, and
I think the only people that are going to benefit from what's happening in Seattle is U-Haul, because I can't imagine people aren't going to pour out of there. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about a disconnect. One of our members has family in the Portland area, and they commute to downtown, and they don't see rioters. They just see the graffiti and the remnants, but they don't see the actual rioting, and then they go back to their world. And then the same disconnect is with the media, calling this mostly peaceful, protest. How can people be missing this?
Yeah, it actually is easy to miss if you don't live or work within the areas of the riots. And the riots don't last 24/7. It wasn't like Chad in Portland. It's not like Chaza where they actually took over an area for, you know, 24 hours a day. The riots happened for about maybe 5 or 6 hours every night. In Portland, it was in a 3x3 area in downtown by the courthouses. And now, unfortunately, it's moved to residential areas on the east side of the city, southeast in North Portland. And there's been 12 riots and unlawful assemblies declared ever since they moved out of downtown to riot in these residential areas. Residents and business owners are starting to speak up in the local media. But I don't fault people to be like, what's going on? I don't see anything. It's kind of like if you don't live in the Capitol Hill area of Seattle, it was entirely possible for you to go 3 weeks without actually driving by and seeing what was happening in Chaz. The city occupies obviously a very large geographical area, and 3 blocks or 6 blocks might not sound like a lot, but just see like the anarchy of ceding public space to violent extremists, I think, is unacceptable. And the fact that it's reoccurring and that these rioters claim the space as theirs, and they actually kick out not just police, to kick out media who they don't rely on, that they don't trust for sympathetic coverage. So like when
So they have their own rules, which is ironic, right? So they have border checks, they have their own police, they have exactly what they say they don't want, right? And do they ever see the I won't even ask if they see the irony in this. I guess that's a silly question. I want to read a quote from the mayor, if I could, from Portland's mayor. And he says, "Don't think for a moment that if you're participating in this activity, you are not being a prop for the re-election campaign of Donald Trump. Because you absolutely are. You are creating the B-roll film that will be used in his ads nationally to help Donald Trump during his campaign. If you don't want to be part of that, then don't show up." So what I heard was the mayor is not saying, don't stop burning buildings and destroying property because it's wrong, but rather because it'll help Donald Trump. So does it strike you as odd, as someone who calls Portland home, that that's the reason they should stop?
Well, the mayor and those in city council have been providing a lot of morale to the rioters by ignoring and obfuscating their violence. So the statement that you actually just read was actually an improvement based on things that the mayor had said previously, as bad as that political statement is. But he's slowly coming to the point because he had pushed this false narrative, which is demonstrably false, that the rioters were only rioting because of the presence of DHS and the US Marshals, which is untrue, by the way. The additional reinforcements didn't come into the city of Portland until around the 4th of July, at which point that was already 5 weeks of rioting in Portland. And then so even with the withdrawal, the visible withdrawal of these federal officers, the rioting continued and it moved to residential areas. So he had to come out and sort of softly condemn what was happening because they've been, they broke into the police union building, set it on fire this past week. They set other buildings on fire, they start fires on the streets. But Portland is such a far left political monoculture, much in the same way like Oakland or San Francisco is that you can't even be center left Democrat. Like everything that your political messaging has to be coached within or framed within this whole opposition to the federal administration, opposition to Trump, opposition to Republicans. It's unfortunate, but for many Portlanders, that's the only language they can really understand. Portland is a city where like Trump derangement syndrome has infected everybody. So that's why this tolerance of the violence in the city happens, because people here, a critical mass of them, are sympathetic to the reasons for why people are being violent.
Yeah. It seems that political violence is being normed. Nancy Pelosi said something about how she doesn't care much about statues being torn down. People will do what they do. Andy, you were attacked. So this isn't a fantasy. This isn't a myth. You were actually attacked. Can you tell us how you're doing and what's happening with your lawsuit?
That was more than a year ago. That was on the 29th of June, 2019. Actually, I was right in front of the Justice Center, which is one of the county buildings in downtown, one of the buildings that's been attacked recently. But I was recording a demonstration, a so-called anti-racist demonstration organized by the Democratic Socialists of America and Rose City Antifa. And they had threatened and targeted me before and assaulted me, but I just kept going. Perhaps maybe I was naive, or maybe I just kept thinking that this was in front of the police precinct. Nobody's going to be emboldened to actually attack somebody in front of the police precinct, are they? Well, you know, when I was just there with my GoPro and my phone, that's exactly what happened. I got jumped by a mob. Some of the video that was recorded shows the second half of the beating. Actually, the worst half was the first, when there were repeated punches to my head in every direction. And then they stole my equipment, and then they threw liquids in my eye, like milkshakes, eggs, and other things. So I couldn't even see which way to leave. And afterward, I was diagnosed. I had to be hospitalized. I was diagnosed with a brain bleed, and I've been suffering from the consequences of that for a year. And you know, through all my reporting, you see that I've been really big. It's important for me to present law enforcement fairly and to give them a fair shake, because the local and the national media has been so biased against police. And so I genuinely believe that the detectives and the Portland police would take my case seriously, as well as the attorney, the DOJ for the District of Oregon. But unfortunately, nobody was charged, much less even arrested. And so in the time since, I had to move forward with a civil lawsuit against those that I was able to identify myself, and which took really hundreds of hours of work, you know, and myself and my legal counsel, which is Harmeet Dillon, she's based in San Francisco. You know, we don't have the tools of law enforcement. So it was so much work to just identify just a few people, not all of them. And we're moving forward with the civil lawsuit, and I really appreciate Mr. Murphy at the beginning mentioning how your members can support that cause if you want.
I think it's so important, because when we're supporting you, we're also supporting all Americans.
Thank you.
In that sense, right? Because nobody should be assaulted and not have justice like that.
At the time last year, I kept, you know, in all my interviews, I was warning that Portland was a harbinger for what's to come. And unfortunately, that's come true this year. The violence did not just stay in Portland, it spread to other cities. And the thing is, they can sort of activate at any, like instantly. Like Minneapolis, the violence there was quite spontaneous. And Antifa have rioting down to an art. They already have all the literature and manuals for how to. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, Andy, I just want to jump in with that right there, because everybody wants to understand who's funding this, right? They're well organized, clearly, right? Who is funding this, and what is the history of that funding?
So the funding, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about George Soros or other mega donors. I don't actually see evidence of that. What I see concrete evidence for in Portland and other cities is these so-called nonprofits that operate quite openly on GoFundMe or Cash App or Venmo, claiming to be, let's say, the bail fund for what they say are peaceful protesters, whether in Minneapolis or in Portland, and people around the country pour in hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars. In Minnesota, their bail fund received $35 million with the help of celebrities and the public. And the people they're bailing out are people accused of sex crimes, murder even. In Portland, $1.3 million was raised. So everybody who has been arrested at these riots in Portland, if they're not already let out without bail, which the majority of them are, those who, because of the seriousness of the offenses, where there's a bond, these nonprofits step in and pay it and get them out immediately. And then there are other groups that are established, these ad hoc groups that take in money to provide pro bono legal support. In Portland, a whole bunch of groups, like there's so many different names that don't even really matter. It's really the same people just calling themselves a group and then opening up a Cash App or Venmo. And for people not familiar with Cash App or Venmo, these are ways kind of like PayPal where you can send money easily through your phone. And they're pulling in hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're buying supplies for the rioters, like buying things like umbrellas, buying things like lacrosse sticks. And so this has all been documented, and I've been trying to bring to the public's attention how GoFundMe, Venmo, and Cash App are playing a role in the violent criminal conspiracy. Unfortunately, nothing's been done. I raised this to Congress attention last week. I don't know if they listened.
Let's talk about your experience at Congress for a minute. I want to make sure that we touch on that, Andy. It looked to me almost odd that there was a lack of curiosity from one side about what you were sharing.
Not just a lack of curiosity, they completely ignored me. There were no Democrat senators in the room when I spoke. And, I'm not going to let off the Republicans as well. I think Ted Cruz was the only one there, and he was chairing that hearing. So it was unfortunate that for such an important issue, both Republicans and Democrats didn't show up, really, not just to listen to me, but there was Professor Turley and others who gave testimony about what's been happening. And it's disappointing. It's like, I think, you're also on the West Coast. I know you're probably aware that many people in DC and New York, they don't really care about what's happening out here. They kind of just think, well, who cares about what happens in the Pacific Northwest? It's a small area. Or who cares what happens in Oakland? But as we see, this ideology, it spreads. The tactics that are learned here or learned in Minneapolis or St. Paul are then applied to other places. And actually, Antifa groups put out an after-action report after the success.
An after-action report? Well,
yes, they put out it after Minneapolis for what could be learned. How did we actually overtake the 3rd precinct and burn it down? How do we repeat that elsewhere? What units do we need to establish? So I talked about this in my testimony. It's very organized, and they're learning and they're getting better. In Portland, the rioting, and this is from our law enforcement sources, they say that it's becoming more organized because they're learning every day what works, what doesn't work. How do they escape arrest? How do they de-arrest their comrades, which means pulling out one of their comrades when police are actively in the middle of arrest, which, by the way, likely won't get prosecuted even if they're charged.
Yeah.
So
it seems that the catch and release program is very active, known, and used, because what you document is these people are out on it within hours. They could try to set a building on fire with people in it and actually be released within hours. Andy, I know our members are anxious to get a chance to ask you questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Erica. I just want to ask you one more thing, which is why do you return to this? And what are you doing to stay centered and positive and keep your momentum going in the face of what's truly, truly ugly, and I would argue evil?
Thank you for that question. What I'm seeing on the ground with my eyes, I think it's fair to describe the ideology that has overtaken many of these people as wicked. And I myself am not a religious person, and I know wicked carries a lot of religious connotations, but it does seem like that. These are people who are able to dehumanize their ideological opponents to the point of where they don't just want to see them hurt, but they actually celebrate and revel in seeing opponents potentially killed and or maimed. Like, it has to take a certain amount of depravity in your thinking to really celebrate trying to burn down a building with people inside. And that's what we're seeing. And they celebrate it every night. It's wicked, it is evil. And it's unfortunate that those who are involved in this interstate criminal conspiracy, the majority of them will not be prosecuted, even if they're arrested and charged at all. And why I keep coming back, well, I have a lot of gratitude to the United States. You know, I don't have deep roots in this country. My ancestors didn't fight in World War II or World War I or the Civil War, any of that. But this country provided a refuge for my parents and then my extended family when they were persecuted by their own people, by the communist regime of Vietnam. So, you know, whatever small part I can play in sticking up for liberty in America. And I don't even think I have a particularly partisan message. You know, I warn the public about Antifa because their agenda is to literally destroy the republic, which would mean destroying the Democrats as well. And I tried to tell the Democrats that in my testimony at Congress, but they ignored it, didn't want to believe it. And many of them are actually empowering Antifa and other revolutionary movements in the US to the demise of all Americans, actually.
Oh, Andy, your courage is astonishing. I'm going to turn this over to Erica. So she's going to offer some questions from our group. Erica?
Yes, thanks, Jane, and thank you, Andy. That was, we're all mesmerized, and I know that because the number of participants are either stable or going up, and often there are people that, you know, find out they're, you know, it's late in the evening, they need to do something, but you've got everyone captured and everyone's really enjoying your comments. Some of the questions have already been answered by the presentation, and Jane sort of sought them out, and so if you don't hear your question, people, it's maybe because Andy's already mentioned it, but there's still a lot of really great questions. I have one of my own that I thought about as I was thinking about your presentation this evening. Of course, you're the expert on Portland. There are outbreaks in other cities as well. If you had to guess 6 months from now, is it going to be better, the worse, or same? Or you have no idea? Also an acceptable answer.
It's going to get worse because the precedent that has been set in response to the riots from not just politicians, but the media establishment, the chattering classes, is that it's okay to riot if your cause is justified. And in their mind, any far left cause is justified. So you see very influential media institutions coming out in support of toppling of public property, for example, of downplaying organized criminal intents to break into a federal courthouse and set it on fire. That's just laying the groundwork for political violence that's going to likely happen in November. I'm really scared about, clearly, given what's been happening in the past several months, there's no political will in a lot of Democrat-run cities to actually stop left-wing violent extremism on the streets. So if President Trump were to win again, we could have a whole nother outbreak of violence similar to what we happened before, but maybe even worse, given that, you know, as we're getting closer to the election, the reckless rhetoric is being heated up. And, you know, here's the other thing too. This is not to say that things would be better if Biden was to win. If you look at the responses from the radical far left to Biden and now his VP pick, Kamala Harris, they're not happy. They hate the liberal establishment as well. So when they say things like burn it down, They literally mean it. You can look through the literature. They want to destroy the US. They have as much contempt for the Democrat Party as they do Republicans. It's easier for them to hijack anti-Trump demonstrations rather than other ones. But regardless of who wins in November, there's going to be outbreak of violence, and the people who suffer in urban areas are business owners, people, and law-abiding citizens. Not only will their property and lives not be protected, those who get arrested likely won't face prosecution.
And your opinion is certainly corroborated as recently in the last 24 to 48 hours with what happened in Chicago. Apparently some people who were interviewed after the looting said, well, why would you do this? Weren't you afraid? And the answers came back, well, nothing happened last time. So that only is supported why you do that. Well, this evening has been instructive to me of some of our listeners are aware of other organizations beyond Antifa that might be related. So I'll ask you about those if you're aware of them or their role. But there's another one that is well known, and that's Black Lives Matter, BLM. Is there a relationship between the two, or are they just two independent people who like to stir the pot?
They're two separate movements that have become each more dangerous because they cross-pollinate one another. Black Lives Matter as the organization, and when I say Black Lives Matter, I mean, the actual capital organization, is founded by 3 women who are openly identified as Marxist ideologues. And their whole so-called agenda of abolishing law enforcement is on a path to really have regime change in America. They would like to see a communist regime ushered in. So there are reasons why they honor and revere violent communist terrorists like Assata Shakur, who was convicted for killing an officer and is a fugitive believed to be in Cuba. There's reasons they honor people like her and others is because they believe the same goal, which is to topple the government. That has now cross-pollinated with Antifa. So Antifa, the traditional form of it is this anarchist communism. But as you notice, most of the people who are part of that movement are young white people. And because of right now, everything is focused on so-called racial justice. To give themselves more legitimacy, they've taken on at least the rhetoric and some causes from Black Lives Matter. So you'll see in addition to all cops are bastards, one of the most other common chants you'll hear at these Antifa riots are Black Lives Matter. They'll chant that, and they'll chant the names of other people that they consider martyrs. Both of them push each other more radically in different ways. And I think the issue or the genius of both movements is that they cloak themselves in language that is considered really sort of sacrosanct to a lot of Americans, understandably. When you say you support Black lives, that sounds like a very noble cause. When you say you are against fascism, that sounds very noble. So they take on these sort of descriptors, but it's meant to deceive, right? Because if you look at the writings of those who founded Black Lives Matter, it's anti-American, it's anti-family, it's Marxist. And of course, if you look at the literature from Antifa propaganda, again, it's a violent, revolutionary, anti-government movement and ideology. So all of this, unfortunately, is masquerading under so-called racial justice.
Of course. And we must have 6 to 8 individual questions of various verbiage that all deal with protesters getting paid. Is that rumor or documented? How does it happen? And of course, who's funding that? If you have any guesses.
So several months back, there was a video, I forget which city it was, showing a person dressed in black giving cash to a protester or a demonstrator. This was in the wake of the George Floyd related riots. and asking him essentially to riot. I don't know what that ultimate investigation is. It's probably still ongoing, so I won't comment on that. I think that video helps spur a lot of these rumors. From what I'm seeing on the ground in Portland, there's no cash payment to people, but the payment is in a different form. So, and the evidence for that is, as I said earlier, there are all these groups that have popped up to supply people, not just with pro bono legal aid, but bailout money, supplies to riot, gear to riot, as well as food, a place to stay. People open up their homes or they buy tents, support these people. So it's more of providing everything else other than cash payment to these people. And when you're having a lot of people who are unemployed and have nothing to do, and you're providing everything laid out to riot and to continue to riot, it's going to draw in people. So it's an indirect form of payment, and it's a problem as well. Hopefully, the DOJ will look into how these various groups are using crowdfunding to participate in to maintain a criminal conspiracy, violence and illegal demonstrations in the streets, and illegal occupations as well.
We have a couple of questions that deal with the irony of you being an immigrant and, to use the vernacular, a person of color, and you were attacked by white people. In many police departments that would be perhaps a hate crime, or was there ever any kind of follow-up based on that? Sounds like no, since there have no arrests been made.
You're right. If I had different politics, my cause would have been picked up not just by the mainstream media and local advocacy organizations and the mayor's office, but also the Portland Police Bureau. But because my politics are perceived as conservative, it doesn't matter that I'm gay, it doesn't matter that I'm a person of color, it doesn't matter that I was beaten in broad daylight in the middle of downtown during Pride Month last year. It doesn't matter. And you see in so many of these videos that conservative activists of some type of minority background put out, they're subject to the worst vitriol because they're treated as traitors, really. Traitors to what the far left expect them to. They want people like myself to fall in line. And when we don't, they smear us with, race traitors or other racially driven slurs. I myself have been smeared with being called neo-Nazi, white supremacist, all these lies, and it doesn't stick with me, but it's opened up my eyes to see how other people who maybe happen to be white, who are conservative activists, are also smeared with these labels, and it unfortunately does stick. And so, I speak out not just to, I speak out in part to defend many good people who have been defamed endlessly by media and by even local governments.
And related to your assault, I think a very obvious question is with the FBI, why has it been so difficult? If there was a group that is causing this much damage at a predictable level, I think the FBI would get involved. Interstate happens all over the place. Any thoughts on that, or was your Senate hearing, did that offer any light as to why the FBI wouldn't get involved?
Well, the things we're learning about the FBI demonstrate particularly how political that agency is at the highest levels. It's my perception that for that reason, they don't really want to verbally come down hard on Antifa. I don't know what's happening behind the scenes, but there's a lot of political and career consequences because of the press of what they can do for those who come out against Antifa. I mean, you can look at how they have smeared a great man like the Attorney General William Barr and he's spoken very honestly about Black Lives Matter's Marxist worldview, as well as Antifa's criminal activities. And so, you know, for those sort of career politicians who want to continue to get those glowing stories in the press, they're not going to come down hard on the far left. And the media also perpetuates certain lies about how nobody's been killed by Antifa or the far left. I mean, I constantly bring up, just last year, there were 3 attacks. There was an attack in Eugene that resulted in the death of an Antifa militant. He tried to attack school resource officers in a shooting, and he was killed in the process. There was the attack on the ICE facility in Tacoma, Washington by another Antifa militant who actually left behind a manifesto. He firebombed, and he was killed in the process. He came armed with a rifle. And then in Dayton, Ohio, there was an Antifa militant who killed 9 people. You know, just a couple of weeks ago, people were holding campaigns to raise awareness about the shooting that happened in El Paso last year. That same weekend was the Dayton, Ohio mass shooting, and nobody wants to remember that. And that's because of the politics of the killer. It's unfortunate that it seems like you're only likely to get justice if the perpetrators hold a certain political ideology.
And this is a great segue to what you just shared with us. With the exception of Ohio, most of this Antifa activity is in blue states and not in red states. That almost seems backwards, or perhaps is there more hatred for the left from Antifa because they figure they're closer to what they're not supposed to be, if that makes sense? Or why would there not be more Antifa activity in Oklahoma or Texas or places like that?
So yes, most of the open militant organizing in terms of rioting in the streets do happen in very progressive blue places, and that's because of the tolerance that local government has for that.
Sure, makes
and
sense.
the high hand tying of law enforcement. However, it's a mistake to think that there's not Antifa roots in very red places in the US, and there are. For example, the sort of the regional hotspot for Antifa in the southeast of the US is actually in Asheville, North Carolina. A lot of it is tied to like sort of progressive pockets in red areas. In Texas, it would be Austin. But, you know, they have a presence there. And sometimes if they are not able to riot locally, they'll travel elsewhere. One of the people arrested this past week in Portland and charged with felony riot and other serious offenses is somebody who came to Portland from Kentucky. So, you know, they move around, but they have hot spots in red areas. And, you know, people who are just thinking that, you know, they're not going to come to you, I think it's somewhat slightly naive. I'm sure a lot of people in Portland didn't think that the violence in downtown would spread to the residential areas, but it has, and it did last night. It will likely tonight. They've already announced where they're meeting. So, you know, I mean, what can happen, the difference, I guess, between red places and blue places is very much a response from the local government. Compare the governor in Oregon versus, let's say, a governor in Texas. You know, the one in Oregon has given all these sort of positive things defending the protesters. And when they say protesters, they apply that to peaceful protesters as well as rioters and make no distinction.
Sure, sure. And getting back to your local expertise of Portland, is Ted Wheeler up for re-election in November? And if so, is he in trouble? What's the mood of the people of Portland?
Portland also has some dark times ahead because the position of mayor has a lot of power in Portland in that that person is also the police commissioner. It's a dual role. It's very unique. I think it's left over from the days of the Wild West. Most cities have gotten rid of this dual mayor / police commissioner. But in Portland, that system remains. And that's one reason why the mayor has so even more influence than usual over the police department. And yes, he's up for re-election. He's running again. But his main opponent identifies herself as an Antifa mayor. And so she is even further to the left of Ted Wheeler.
Oh my.
She's been to some of these violent demonstrations. Her campaign manager is an open communist who organized many protests in 2016 when Trump was elected that then later devolved into riots. So she's extreme, and Portlanders are given the choice of her or Ted Wheeler. So
she's his best friend, if that's that word it's coming out from there. There's a question here that deals with people like you that came from communist backgrounds, whether it's Asia or Eastern Europe, that are often the most patriotic. And is there hope with that? Are you alone? Are there other people with whom you can kind of share this a bond?
I wish I had more hope, but I think what's happened for the generation of people whose parents escaped communist regimes is that we don't have in our memory what happened to our parents' generation. A lot of us are really extremely ignorant of that recent history. So you see many people who are the children of immigrants, whether they are Cuban Americans or Vietnamese American, Chinese American, really being brainwashed until the ideologies that are in our educational institutions, even before universities. You see the far left, I would call it cultural Marxist, neo-Marxist ideologies in K through 12, and of course they're in universities. And so that my generation, people like us are also brainwashed. And, it's always been very puzzling to me when I see Cuban American, second generation Americans or Vietnamese Americans who take up the mantle of the far left or Antifa, and whereas their family escaped communist regimes. I don't know what can help reverse that. I think the GOP, in my view, has not done a good job at reaching out to the Asian American diaspora at all. And it's unfortunate, but yeah, it's such a sad irony that many of the children of these immigrants are trying to turn the society their parents fled to where their parents came from.
Yeah, this doesn't seem to make sense at all. Well, we'll be wrapping up in a few minutes, and then I'll turn it back over to Jane, who will do the final goodbye and announce future speakers. But before we do that, I want to first point out that there were many, many comments that thank you for not just your time tonight, but your incredible courage and your nice demeanor as to how you can convey your thoughts so succinctly and with a lot of feeling obviously behind it. And would like to again, just as Keone opened the meeting, to make it more easy for people to help you, to donate to your cause. And I think there was there a Keone, I see your little avatar there. Do you have something on the there it is. Hello. That do you have a link or a website for Andy to help him? Are we going to do that?
Well, we'll put the link on our website.
Okay, it'll be on the website, and that's the name of the organization again.
Center for American Liberty. The website is libertycenter.org. Thank you.
Libertycenter.org, everyone, to help out Andy and to his thoughts. So Jane, if you're back in the ether, say goodbye.
I also want to remind you that Andy has a book coming out. It's called Unmasked. Andy, when will that be out?
It won't be out until February of next year, but it's available for pre-order now.
How cool is that? I don't know how you have time to write a book. I truly don't.
It's hard.
Yeah. The founder of Turning Point, Charlie Kirk, recently, I heard him recently address some college students, and he said he had lost all his friends. It was really sad when he described it, all his football buddies. He had just basically lost all his friends because of his passion for freedom. And he kind of acknowledged to the kids that if they go on campus and they fight for freedom and they stand up for liberty, that's not unlikely to happen to them. But he said, do it. He said, because, well, one, because it's important. And two, he said, it will make you stronger, actually. And I know that this has come at quite a cost to you to be part of this fight. You have been attacked. You have suffered brain damage. You have had your family threatened. The price of liberty is really high right now. It's terribly high. And I think that we all actually need to think about how we're going to pay it so that we don't lose it. You were described as, quote, the driving force behind increasingly hostile national attitudes towards the decentralizing Antifa activist movement. I would say, my friend, that is a compliment, because there should be nothing but hostile attitudes towards such evil. So I thank you for coming. I'm terribly humbled, actually, to be in the presence of such courage. And we know that when we all tuck ourselves in tonight, you'll just be getting to work, getting busy putting yourself out so that we can know what's really happening in our cities. I thank you so much, Andy. I also want to thank Michelle Malkin, who encouraged us to have you, and that was a wonderful idea. We are going to have John Yoo come and speak to us on Trump and the Constitution on September 8th, so we hope you all will join us. And Andy, would you like to have any closing remarks?
I would just encourage all your members to continue being brave. I think as the story you mentioned from Charlie Kirk, it's the consequences of being today a dissident in our current political and social culture. The consequences are severe. On one level, you can lose your social contacts, potentially even family contacts. For myself, I have my physical safety to worry about, but I think, as I said at my testimony last week, the consequences are remaining silent or worse. And I think Portland and San Francisco and Seattle and other cities are examples of what happens when people stand bilaterally and allow a violent extremist movement to move forward with this agenda through using, in my view, terrorist tactics.
Thank you, Andy, for your courage, for your patriotism, and for being with us tonight. So until next month, we will sign off. I want to say good night to everyone and stay free.